understand the history of it. And we want to take very seriously what it says. You know, you might want to know.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Mm-hmm.
So, pardon me if I'm not.
No, you're fine.
Okay. The purpose of the Psalms, were they not in worship?
Yeah, they were used in worship, and this is kind of where I'm driving our boat. I think we can probably cut to the end and take it to a break a little bit. The Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 1. Did somebody grab it?
3 verse 1. Mm-hmm. Just the verse 1?
Yeah.
Is it the verse 1 basis on the Hebrew context or on the?
No, I think it's in your text. There it should be anyway.
Okay, because mine says it says canticle, prayer of Habakkuk the prophet to a plaintive tune.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the context of the rest of what he says, it's clear that Habakkuk prayed this prayer, that this actually was authored. Now, the reason why that might be relevant is that it has the same construction. It's La David and here La Habakkuk. So it seems, from what we can best infer, that if you're going to infer anything, it's probably by David. But then you have to say, were these titles original to the document or not? And the answer is probably not. They were probably added later after the psalm was composed. And so how do we end up regarding these things? You know, what social function, what historical value do they have? And the way I would encourage you to approach this as somebody reading is to not read it as a settled case that this is the author of the psalm. For example, Psalm 51, it ends up being one of those really important ones because it gives us not just a name, but it also gives us a circumstance. You know, this is written by David when he sinned with Bathsheba. And so do we read the entirety of this psalm as though it were a reflection on that historical incident that we know about? Is it dominated by that? And the answer is certainly somebody thought that reflection would inform the psalm. But it need not have such an authoritative weight that we say, absolutely, this is the only way we can read this psalm. And so if the psalm ends up saying things that would be out of place in David's context, another example would be one of the other psalms is allegedly of David or written by David, but then it starts to talk about the temple. Well, as we know from the book of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, David didn't construct the temple. It was Solomon that constructed the temple. And so why is this talking about the Lord's house or the Lord's temple if David wasn't ever around to see the temple constructed? And so these are those moments where you say, okay, well, what then do we do with these things? Well, we take them as a testimony, as a witness. And where that connection may be illuminating, we can consider it, to be certain. But we need not let it dominate us. And this brings me around to a bigger, more broad scheme thing. That is just to simply say that the Psalms, when we pick them up, end up being kind of generic, and deliberately so. They end up being like psalms, or like hymns that we sing. There's an old yarn about the song or the hymn that we sing called "It Is Well With My Soul," I don't know the detail history off the top of my head, but apparently a guy was traveling across the Atlantic, and the ship sunk, and he wired in a cable from wherever he was rescued, and basically indicated that everybody in his family, nearest family, his wife, his children, were lost, drowned, and at least the preacher story says that this is a reflection on those circumstances, the sorrow, the grief that he felt at having his shipwrecked and losing his immediate family. Well, when you and I gather for worship at Mass, and the musical setting for the day is "It Is Well With My Soul," it would be a nice offertory song, for example. Do we need to sort of put ourselves in the headspace of someone who would have died or had loved ones lost? Well, for somebody that's grieving, that would be pretty nourishing and maybe a little bit helpful. But I've never lost my wife and children, and I've experienced griefs, to be certain. But when I sing that hymn, I'm not trying to put myself in the headspace of the person that wrote it. I'm finding something in it that connects with me, and I love the hymn because of its expression of confidence in ways that end up being pretty relevant to me. And I think that the Psalms end up being generic in exactly the same way. So if it helps for you to consider David's experience of terrible sin, both a sin of murder and a sin of sexual predatory, something not unlike rape, that David would have been guilty of, and the feelings of sorrow and grief for having sinned in such a grievous way, that's not a bad hook to hang on. But it's not as though you have to have a mind meld with David, or you always have to connect a psalm that is allegedly authored by David or by Moses or by Solomon to some meaningful event in their life, as though the psalm was a reflection of their biography.
Some of the psalms are so different. You've got gratitude, joy,
exactly,
lament, despair.
Yeah, and so if that need not dominate us, then and what we'll spend the rest of our time in is, okay, then how can we develop an approach to the Psalms that's historically responsible, that we're not just reading into the Psalm anything that we want, but yet that keeps us with some of the generic nature of the Psalms and the way that Psalms can be adapted like hymns to not just accompany one experience, but indeed a variety of different experiences.
So you say, in essence, in a way, the authors really don't matter. It's more the themes that matter.
Yeah, I think
they're generic to us.
Yeah, I wouldn't say go quite so far as to say not matter at all. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you want to say that they don't matter at all, well, all of a sudden you have to kick out everything that you might know about what it says of David, mm-hmm. and certainly some of David's centrality to Israel's worship life. But to account for it in a way that we don't allow it to dominate our reading would be the way,
So who's not as important as what's said?
Yeah, and so the way I would illustrate it in using your Abraham Lincoln deal, if I read an internet meme that ascribes a quote to Abraham Lincoln, and it's a really good quote, I don't need to. The fact that Lincoln may or may not have written this is relevant in the sense that I might ask the historical question,
Essential.
because a really good quote can come from just about anybody, and so the fact that the idea that it might be Lincoln need not give it any more gravity than it is due, and it need not give it any less because it's falsely attributed to Lincoln. Preach the gospel at all times, and if possible, say something. That's a great quote. It means that we communicate the gospel by our actions, and at sometimes we're called upon to say something. And the idea is that your actions speak louder than your words. Well, does it matter that St. Francis did or did not say that? Well, if you're...
It's interesting.
Yeah, and you know, if you're asking a certain kind of question, the historical question, yeah, it's pretty relevant and pretty important. But is the message regardless of who wrote it? Yeah. And so, you know, the way I've sort of wanted to address the authorship and the context and the historical question seriously, to say that, you know, the Bathsheba incident, you know, somebody at least intended that experience would come into our mind when we read these words. And so do I find the psalm meaningful that God can even forgive a terrible sin like that? Well, if I have committed a terrible, grievous sin, and for a lot of us, we have a hard time forgiving ourselves, right, from terrible things that we've done. We know the harm and the fallout that we've created in other people's lives, and sometimes it's hard to move on from the experience of guilt. Well, that's one of those occasions where reflecting a little bit on David's experience and his terrible sin might open up the psalm to us in a way that's especially meaningful and fruitful. But does David's sin have to dominate our reading or our praying of that psalm as our own prayer? The answer is absolutely not. Well, let's take a couple minutes. By the way, there is casserole here. I would highly suggest, I'm going to wait until the end because it'll make me a little logy, but it's good stuff. I've had it before.
Is there a place to get a cup of water or a cup of coffee here? Or a cup?
Question, is anybody familiar with St. Louis? Because I am not, but I can go explore and
There's
find
a
out.
water fountain right
I mean, a cup so I can keep it in.
There's
There are
cups
cups
right
here.
there.
I don't know where they would have anything set up like this unless it's the kitchen, which is probably.
It's locked.
They do keep it locked.
Yes.
Yeah, they do have a kitchen over here. Oops. I just dropped. Yeah, do they have one like that also? Somebody said they real poor. Thank you. Thank you, Father. Since you can't give it to them, you could turn it into a prayer, read some of it. That's right. This is delicious. Gotta have some. Me too. Well, how does it feel so far?
I my head is so spinning, so I don't think I have time to the mechanics of it. Because yesterday was actually the first afternoon that was playing solo. Yeah, it was great, but I'm still, they're showing me.
There's the office right there. They keep it.
I still have right over there.
There's a place to get.
So I'm praying that they hire someone quickly. I was gonna say,
That's going to school. I'm homeschooling
I mean,
this year,
I
but
love
it's going to school
everything.
here.
Oh, really?
And my dad got married
You
here.
know, once he starts up, it's like, all of a sudden 1,000 questions came into my head, and she's so sweet, she's like,
Oh, she's
"You're
married
never
now."
told me."
Oh, I knew that.